The night my life collapsed started with $10, a silent hallway, a weak body, a small bag pressed tightly against my chest, and a moment that forever changed the way I understood the word family. My name is Brooke Jensen, and I was 19 years old when I stood in that doorway, sick, trembling, barely able to stay upright, clutching a worn-out bag that held everything I owned and everything I was about to lose in a single suffocating moment. My father did not hesitate, did not soften his voice, and did not look at me the way a father should look at his daughter in a moment like that. He threw the money straight into my chest and said, "Take it and get out. Don't come back." The bill hit me before it fell to the floor while my hands shook so badly that I could not bend down to pick it up, and something inside my chest went quiet in a way I did not yet know how to name. My mother stood behind him close enough to hear my breathing, but far enough that she never reached out to touch my shoulder. Her voice was low, steady, and final. "You have been nothing but a burden to this family." I did not argue because the air felt too heavy, my lungs felt too weak, and my body understood faster than my mind that I was no longer welcome, no longer protected, and no longer considered a daughter inside that house. The door closed in front of me, and the lock turned slowly, leaving a sound that stayed in my head far longer than the pain burning in my chest. I stood there longer than necessary, tightening my grip on the bag strap, whispering a promise so small it almost disappeared before it even left my lips, a promise meant for no one to hear. 5 years later, I came back to witness their collapse, when their apologies had already come far too late. Before I continue my story, tell me what time you are watching this and which city you are in, so I can see how far my story has traveled and understand who it is reaching out there. Before my body started to weaken, my world lived inside broken machines. I spent most nights sitting on the bedroom floor with a screwdriver in my hand, pulling apart old computers that people had thrown away, studying every loose wire and cracked board until I began to understand how each piece of silent metal could come back to life under careful fingers. I did not have money for proper tools, so I used bent kitchen knives to pry open cases and wrapped electrical tape around parts that should have been replaced because I wanted to understand how machines thought long before I believed anyone would care what I thought. I taught myself programming through free online manuals that loaded slowly on our unstable internet reading lines of code until my eyes burned, writing small programs, deleting them, rewriting them, learning from every failure without telling anyone in the house what I was building because no one ever asked where my time went when I disappeared after dinner. My father Thomas laughed the first time he saw a circuit board on the kitchen table and said it looked like a waste of time for something that would never feed a family, while my mother Karen barely looked up from folding laundry before saying that technology was not a serious path for a girl who should be thinking about practical work. My sister Brittany never had to explain what she wanted because her interests were treated as important without question, while mine were brushed aside as childish distractions that would pass if ignored long enough. My mother once stood in the doorway of my room and told me that girls like me did not belong in technology. Her words calm but heavy, saying that computers were built for people who were stronger, more confident, more suited for that world, and that I should focus on something simpler before I embarrass myself. I stopped talking about it after that, but I never stopped learning saving small programs onto an old, cracked USB drive that I had found in a drawer, treating it like a secret archive of every idea I was too afraid to share, hiding it in the back of a wooden cabinet under textbooks and forgotten notebooks, so no one would accidentally discover it and throw it away. I worked quietly, repairing neighbors' abandoned machines without charging money, just to feel the satisfaction of a screen lighting up again, feeling my heart steady every time a device responded to something I had written, because those moments were the only times I felt fully awake inside a house that had no space for the version of me that loved invisible systems. By the time my hands started to shake from exhaustion, most nights I already knew that machines understood me in a way people in my own home never tried to. So I kept going, saving more files, learning more languages, building a silent world inside that old USB drive, which felt safer than speaking aloud about dreams that no one in that family wanted to hear. Not long after that, my health started to fall apart quietly. At first, the changes felt small enough for me to ignore, because I believed that if I stayed quiet and kept moving forward, I could outpace whatever weakness was creeping inside my body. I pushed myself through dizziness, shallow breaths, and trembling hands, refusing to admit that something was slowly breaking inside a body that no longer felt fully under my control, even during moments when I tried to pretend that everything was still normal. The fainting started without warning and quickly became impossible to hide. Sometimes it happened in the hallway, sometimes in the kitchen, and sometimes in my room while I tried to sit upright. I would wake up on the cold floor with a bitter taste in my mouth and a strange pressure in my chest, already knowing that another clinic visit was coming before anyone mentioned it, feeling a quiet dread settle in before I even stood up. The clinic slowly became part of my life, even though it never felt normal. The white waiting rooms felt colder each time the plastic chairs felt harder and the forms felt heavier in my hands. I struggled to answer questions honestly because I could already sense that every visit meant another bill. My family did not want to face another silent conversation forming behind closed doors. The envelopes started appearing in the mailbox more often. They sat on the dining table like silent weights that no one wanted to move. The sound of them being opened created more tension than any argument because their presence alone reminded everyone that something in the house was no longer under control, something that could not be ignored much longer. Mom began avoiding my eyes whenever I tried to talk. She kept herself busy with unnecessary chores, folding clothes that were already clean, and wiping counters that did not need attention. She acted as if staying occupied could protect her from having to acknowledge what was happening to me, as though looking away could somehow make the truth fade. Dad stopped hiding his frustration as the bills grew. He complained openly about money, about stress, and about how tired the house felt. He talked about how exhausted he was, how simple life used to be, and how everything felt heavier now. He never realized that every word landed deeper in my chest than the illness itself, carving a quiet kind of hurt that never showed on any medical chart. Brittany responded with clear discomfort. She rolled her eyes when I moved slowly through the hallway. She sighed when I took too long in the bathroom. She tapped her fingers impatiently if I needed the TV volume lowered. Her irritation made it clear that my presence had become something she tolerated, not something she accepted, and that realization settled into me more painfully than any physical weakness ever could. The doctor told me to rest and warned me not to push my body further. Those instructions were treated like background noise inside our home. No one adjusted their expectations. No one treated the advice as something real or urgent, and the meaning behind those words faded quickly into the air. I tried to follow the doctor's words whenever I could. I spent more time lying still even when my thoughts refused to slow down. I listened to doors closing softly and footsteps passing my room. I heard voices lower when money was mentioned. I began to feel less like a person and more like a problem that everyone was forced to manage, a quiet burden that moved through the house without a place to truly rest. As my strength faded, I finally understood the truth. My existence had turned into numbers on paper, quiet arguments, and uncomfortable silences. I was no longer measured by who I was, only by what I cost, what I disrupted, and how much space I took inside a house that stopped feeling like a home. One cold night changed everything inside that house. The air felt heavy in a way I could not explain, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something terrible to finally happen. My body still felt weak from days of exhaustion, but I stood quietly holding myself together by habit, because that had become the only thing I knew how to do without asking for help. Dad stepped forward without hesitation. His hand moved fast, almost careless, when he threw the $10 bill straight into my chest. I felt the edge of the paper hit my skin before it fell to the floor. His voice did not shake when he said, "That's all you get." There was no anger in his tone, only certainty which somehow hurt more than shouting ever could. Mom did not argue or hesitate. She carried my bag across the room and threw it onto the floor near my feet without saying a single word. The sound of the bag hitting the ground felt louder than the house itself, because it was not just fabric touching wood, it was the sound of being removed from a place I had once believed was mine. Brittany stood near the wall and watched everything happen. She did not move closer. She did not turn away. Her face showed no surprise and no concern. She simply observed as if she were watching something that did not involve her, something that would not follow her after the door closed. I bent down slowly to pick up my bag, moving carefully so my legs would not give out. Before I stood up, I walked quietly to the corner of the room and reached for the old laptop I had hidden for so long. My fingers wrapped around its cracked surface and worn edges. I slid it gently into my bag because it was the only thing I owned that still felt alive, the only thing that still connected me to the version of myself I had protected in silence. I walked toward the door without looking back. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of the bag, but because something inside me understood that this moment could never be undone. When I stepped outside, the cold air touched my face and the door closed behind me. I heard the lock turn slowly. That sound stayed inside my chest longer than the cold ever did. My body trembled as I walked down the street, not because I was afraid of the dark, but because my strength was fading. I kept moving anyway, holding the strap of my bag tightly, feeling the shape of the laptop press against my side with every step, reminding me that I still carried something that belonged only to me. That night, I found a bus stop bench and sat down carefully, afraid that if I lay down completely, I would not have the strength to stand again. I pulled my bag onto my lap and wrapped my arms around it. I held the laptop through the thin fabric as if it were something fragile and valuable, because in that moment it was the only thing I had left that felt like a future. My eyes closed slowly as the cold crept into my bones. I slept sitting upright with my back against the metal bench, holding the bag close to my chest. I did not dream of home. I did not dream of them. I only held on to the quiet truth that even with nothing else, I still had the part of myself they never managed to take. Weeks passed before something small changed my direction. Most days began to blend into each other as I moved between shelters, public spaces, and quiet corners where no one asked questions. I learned how to keep my head down, how to make myself invisible, and how to stretch time by sitting still instead of wandering. The public library slowly became the only place where my breathing felt steady, because no one there cared where I came from as long as I stayed quiet. I sat at the same wooden table every afternoon with my old laptop balanced in front of me, fingers moving carefully over broken keys while the screen flickered like it was struggling to stay awake. I worked on lines of code that I had designed in my head long before I ever typed them, because code had always felt more honest than people, more predictable than promises, and safer than conversations that could turn cruel without warning. That afternoon felt no different until the footsteps stopped beside me. I did not look up right away because I had learned that attention often came with a price I could not afford. I kept typing slowly, finishing the current function, fixing a logic error that had annoyed me for days, then saving the file like I always did, careful not to lose the small progress I fought so hard to build. A soft voice broke the silence near my shoulder. "What are you trying to make it do?" I hesitated before answering, surprised that someone would ask about my work instead of about me, my clothes, or my situation. I turned my head slowly and saw a woman standing there with quiet eyes and a calm posture that did not feel threatening. That was the first time I met my mentor, Diane Walker. She did not ask where I was sleeping. She did not ask why I looked tired. She did not ask why I carried a cracked laptop like it was a fragile treasure. She only pointed gently at my screen and asked another question. Why did you choose that structure? No one had ever asked me that before. I explained my idea in a low voice that trembled at first, then slowly steadied as she listened without interrupting. I told her about how I wanted the program to respond faster, to use less memory, to make something simple feel smart in a way that made sense to me. She nodded slightly as if she understood more than she said, and that alone made me feel seen in a way I never felt inside my own home. When the library announced it was closing, I began packing my things without thinking, because leaving had always been part of my routine. Diane stayed standing beside the table. "Where are you going to work tomorrow?" she asked quietly. I tried to keep my answers short because long answers carried too much truth. I told her that I moved around a lot. I told her I found places when I needed them. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking again. "Get in the car." I froze. The words felt too direct to belong to someone who had only known me for minutes, and every instinct in my body told me to be careful. She must have noticed the hesitation because her voice softened. "You can sit in the back. You do not owe me anything." The ride was silent except for the sound of tires on dark streets. I kept my bag tight against my side fingers, resting over the old laptop, prepared to run if the situation turned wrong. It never did. Her house was modest, clean, and quiet in a way that did not feel like a trap. She opened a door down a narrow hallway and turned on the light. A small room. A bed. A desk, she said. "That is all you need for now." I stepped inside slowly, afraid to touch anything, afraid that this would disappear the moment I believed in it. Diane stood in the doorway and crossed her arms. "There is one condition." I looked at her carefully. "You start your program over," she said. "Not because it is bad, but because you deserve to know you can rebuild it stronger." That night, I sat at the small desk with the old laptop open in front of me, staring at a blank screen, feeling a kind of fear that was different from hunger or cold. This fear felt like possibility. 3 silent years changed what people thought I could become. During those years, I stopped thinking of survival as my only goal and began to see possibility as something real, something structured. Something that could be built line by line instead of hoped for blindly. I spent long nights in small rooms with cheap lighting and old furniture, staring at code until my eyes burned, not because I wanted success, but because I needed to prove to myself that my mind still worked even when my body felt fragile. I began developing software designed specifically for small businesses that struggled to keep up with operations, focusing on systems that reduced waste, organized data, and helped owners understand where they were losing time or money. I watched small stores shift from chaos to structure because of tools I designed, and for the first time I felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with being tolerated or ignored. As my confidence grew, I created a separate algorithm that analyzed financial data patterns and predicted risk long before problems surfaced. I sold the rights to that system quietly without announcements or recognition because I did not trust attention yet, but the contracts were real, and the deposits in my account changed the way I understood stability. It was during this period that I was introduced for the first time to my legal advisor, Mark Reynolds, who became responsible for reviewing everything I signed and everything I owned. He was calm, direct, and precise, with his words never treating me like a curiosity or a charity case, but as someone serious about protecting the future I was building. With his guidance, I stopped making decisions based only on instinct and began thinking like someone who planned to stay standing. I became part of a small, independent technology group that focused on building solutions without relying on large corporations. The group was quiet, disciplined, and focused, full of people who believed in constructing something slowly instead of chasing headlines. I learned how to collaborate without losing control of my work and how to defend my ideas without raising my voice. The contracts that came after that were larger than anything I had once imagined. Companies that would have ignored me years earlier began asking for my work, not knowing my story, not caring about my past, seeing only the results I could produce. Each signed agreement changed the quiet math of my life and replaced fear with careful planning while still keeping my heart steady instead of arrogant. Over time, my financial position shifted from fragile to solid, then from solid to strong, until I reached a point where private financial invitations started to arrive. I was qualified on paper and, in fact, to participate in closed asset auctions that were never advertised publicly. These were quiet rooms, quiet signatures, quiet transfers of ownership, all happening far from noise or spectacle. I never felt hungry for revenge. I never felt loud satisfaction. What I felt was a calm control that had been missing my entire life, a steady awareness that I no longer needed permission to exist, to choose, or to stand in rooms that once would have felt unreachable. By the end of those 3 years, I was no longer surviving inside the shadow of what I lost. I was building inside the reality of what I had earned. 5 years after I disappeared from their lives. Time had moved in strange directions for all of us, yet I did not learn about their downfall through rumors or emotional messages, but through cold systems and quiet data that showed no sympathy. Brittany had been living far beyond what she could earn, chasing a lifestyle that looked impressive from a distance, while hiding the cracks behind borrowed money, careless signatures, and false promises that grew heavier each month. Her spending became less controlled as time passed, and she treated credit as if it were endless, assuming there would always be another solution waiting before the consequences caught up to her. Mom and Dad never understood how deep it went, because Brittany learned how to speak in soft reassurances and confident explanations that made everything sound temporary. She prepared documents for them and explained them in ways that sounded simple enough to trust, even though the words carried consequences they could not recognize without help. At some point, they signed papers connected to debt, without fully understanding what they were agreeing to, believing they were only helping Brittany fix something small, when in reality they were tying their own stability to a growing financial disaster they could not see clearly. When creditors started asking real questions, Brittany stopped answering her phone. Her behavior shifted quietly at first, then turned into long absences and locked doors inside the same house she had once controlled. The day finally came when she left without telling anyone where she was going, taking what she could carry, disappearing before Mom and Dad could understand that she was not coming back to face what she had created. The silence she left behind was not peaceful. It was filled with letters, warnings, and official notices that arrived in thick envelopes marked with urgent language that Mom and Dad struggled to understand. Banks began freezing accounts and blocking credit cards one by one, leaving them unable to access money they believed they still controlled. Assets that once made them feel safe became liabilities overnight. The house that had once felt permanent shifted into something fragile that could be taken away at any moment. The legal process moved faster than they expected. Court filings were delivered without emotion, and legal language turned their confusion into formal reality. The house was placed into a forced sale process, its address appearing in systems that recorded properties moving toward seizure. What once felt like their strongest possession was reduced to an entry on a list that grew longer every day. I never saw this collapse through emotional stories or secondhand gossip. I saw it through secured databases, auction previews, encrypted notifications, and quiet alerts sent through systems meant for investors, lawyers, and qualified buyers. One evening, while reviewing a list of properties flagged for restricted bidding, I recognized the address before the street name fully loaded on my screen. The structure appeared as a simple digital profile with no reference to memories or history, only square footage, legal status, and auction classification. I stared at the information in silence, not because I felt satisfaction, but because I felt the distance between who I used to be and who I had become. That house was no longer a home in my mind. It was now an asset moving through a system that treated it without emotion, the same way my own existence had once been treated without care. My hands did not shake as I studied the details, yet my thoughts slowed as I understood the strange symmetry of the moment. Mom and Dad were still living inside a space that had already been marked for removal from their control. They were probably unaware of how close the final step had become, still believing that talking to the right person might fix something that had already passed the point of negotiation. Brittany was nowhere to be found. The silence she had left behind had become structural damage, legal action, and irreversible timelines. I saved the listing quietly. I did not tell anyone. I did not react outwardly. I simply let the screen stay open for a few seconds longer before closing it, fully aware that the next time that address appeared in my life, it would not be as the girl who was thrown out with nothing but as someone who finally had the power to choose what happened next. The papers felt colder than the night I was pushed outside. I sat at the long conference table with my hands resting calmly on the folder, fully aware of the weight of the moment without allowing my expression to reveal anything. The private auction had ended through a company I built in silence, structured carefully to carry no trace of old wounds, no visible connection to the girl who once stood outside in the dark, pretending she was not freezing. Mark, my legal advisor, stood beside me with the quiet focus that always surrounded him. He moved through the documents with steady clarity, confirming each clause, carefully explaining each legal step without emotion, then guiding the final pages toward me when everything had been verified. His presence held the room together even as tension quietly tightened across every surface. Mom and Dad sat across from me, expecting to meet a stranger, a corporate representative, or an anonymous investor who would never understand what this home had once meant. They were not prepared to see my name appear clearly in the buyer section, written in plain letters that carried no anger but carried full truth. The silence changed as soon as they recognized it. Mom tightened her grip on the chair beneath her, her breath turning shallow as her voice dropped into a whisper she could barely control. She said, "You don't have to do this." Dad leaned forward slowly, the years of stress visible in the way his shoulders folded inward. His voice came out uneven, stripped of authority, filled only with quiet fear. He said, "We are still your parents." Mom stood from her seat without thinking, her hands pressed together as if the movement might hold her steady while her world continued to collapse. She moved closer to the table and began to plead, not as someone with control, but as someone who had lost everything she once believed could protect her. She asked me to reconsider. She asked for time. She asked for mercy. Dad followed her voice. His words lost their shape as he tried to speak again. He asked me not to let them lose the last thing they had. He asked me to remember what had once existed. He asked if being their daughter still had any meaning left inside me. I did not answer him. There was no anger inside my chest. There was no need to defend myself. There was no satisfaction waiting in silence. I lowered my eyes only long enough for Mark to confirm that every approval had been received. My hand remained steady when I signed. The sound of pen against paper felt controlled, final, and clear. There was no hesitation in the movement. There was no shaking in my fingers. The decision had been made long before this room existed. When the final document was collected, I stood slowly. I walked past them without allowing my eyes to soften. I moved through the hallway without pausing. I stepped outside without turning my head. Behind me, there was no longer a family that could claim me. There was only a life that no longer required their permission to exist. Your value does not come from people who failed to protect your spirit. No parent owns your identity. No house has the right to decide your future. Distance is not cruelty when it becomes the only way to survive with clarity, dignity, and self-respect. Protecting yourself is not abandonment. Sometimes it is the strongest form of healing. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you were standing in Brooke's place, I would truly want to understand your choice. Would you leave in silence, or would you speak from the place that was once wounded? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me how you would face a moment like this, because your perspective may help someone who feels invisible right now.